Hi everybody, this is Sue Altmeyer and welcome to the Tax Law Research module. First we're going to have an overview of sources. So how is researching tax law different than researching other types of law? First of all, there's a vast array of administrative documents that have different weights of authority, so you want to find out what these different things are and what they can be used for. Also, what authorities you can cite to depends on what you're arguing. If you're arguing whether a tax is owed or not, then you can only cite to things that are higher authority. If you are arguing that a penalty is not owed, then you could cite to more different types of authority, such as a private letter ruling, which traditionally only is considered binding between the parties. Okay, so actions can be filed in different courts. That's something else different about tax law. It could be filed in the United States Tax Court, United States District Court, or the United States Court of Federal Claims. So you want to find out, do these different courts have different authority? When should you file in each, etc. So the authority to create the Internal Revenue Code, to create your tax statutes, comes from the U.S. Constitution. There's many sections of the U.S. Constitution which deal with tax. I'm just going to mention two big ones: Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, which gives Congress the power to tax, and the 16th Amendment, which gives the Congress the power to collect income taxes. So you might run across a constitutional issue when you're doing tax law. Be sure to remember that the annotated constitutions are on Lex and Westlaw, so you have your nice court decisions, your nice court annotations right there, handy and ready to use. The ultimate authority, besides the Constitution, of course, is the Internal Revenue Code. This is the tax legislation as passed by Congress. So when you cite to the Internal Revenue Code, you can actually use a shorter format. If you are writing a court document or legal memorandum, you could use a shorter format than the traditional, 26 USC section whatever format, and then the publisher and the year and all that other stuff. You can just put this. However, that is only if you're only citing to current versions of the federal tax laws. Okay, recall that there is proposed legislation that you should keep up on. We learned about this in the Federal Legislative History module. You can find proposed legislation on congress.gov, among other sources. Currently, we have pending this is December 2017, so we have pending the Donald Trump tax reform thing, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And you can also use legislative history to argue that the Internal Revenue Code means one thing or another. And you can use ProQuest, or there's legislative history documents on the internet, everything we learned about in that legislative history module. There's something else I wanted to point out, another congressional document, which is issued by the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. It's called the Blue Book. Now, this is different, obviously, from the Blue Book that deals with legal citation format. This Blue Book is a summary and description of tax legislation that was recently passed. It's written after the statutes are passed, so it's not legislative history. So you don't want to cite to this in a brief or anything like that, but you can use this to avoid underpayment penalties. Treasury Regulations. Next in our hierarchy, first we have the Internal Revenue Code, followed by Treasury Regulations. Treasury Regulations interpret and flesh out the tax code. Treasury Regulations are the Treasury Department's official interpretation of how a particular Internal Revenue Code section is to be administered and applied. If the Internal Revenue Code changes, new regulations may be needed. And in that case, temporary regulations can provide guidance until final regulations can be adopted. So in this slide, I have a summary of the three different types of regulations and whether they are binding or not. The ones that are binding, that have a high weight of authority, are your final regulations and temporary regulations. One exception of a final regulation is the Statement of Procedural Rules, which is not mandatory. Temporary regulations have the same weight as final regulations, and they expire after 3 years. Proposed regulations are not binding unless they happen to be marked as reliance regulations. Okay, just an example of how a Treasury regulation fleshes out the Internal Revenue Code. So this is your Internal Revenue Code section for the child care tax credit. So if the person who is being paid to take care of the children is a dependent or a child under 19, then there's no credit. That's what your Internal Revenue Code section says. The Treasury regulation expands on this and says, additionally, the babysitter, the person taking care of the children, cannot be the taxpayer's spouse or the parent of the child if they're a qualifying individual. Also, you cannot create a partnership to avoid these rules. So you see it's adding more to what is in the Internal Revenue Code, the regulation is. Finding Treasury regulations. Just like any other regulations, these regulations appear in the Federal Register, your proposed temporary and final regulations. You might see this Cite TD, something like that. It means Treasury decisions. This, in fact, means that it is a final or temporary regulation. Treasury decision sounds like it's some kind of court opinion or administrative body opinion. It's not. Treasury decision is a regulation. So, of course, final regulations are codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. And there's another publication which the IRS issues weekly. Of course, you recall Federal Register comes out every day, but weekly there is something called the Internal Revenue Bulletin, and this contains final, temporary, and proposed regulations. Also, it includes, at least I believe for final and temporary regulations, explanatory preambles, which are not the law but can be helpful. There is a short form that you can use to cite regulations. You could simply put Treasury Regulation, section, whatever it is. And don't forget that you could shepherdize or key cite a regulation to see if it's still good law. Administrative decisions and materials that have high authority and that you can cite in determining whether a tax is owed. And we're going to, in a later lecture, we're going to go over in more detail what these different types of administrative rulings and administrative issuances are. So we have revenue rulings. They have a high weight of authority. It's the IRS. Applies the law to a particular set of facts. This is not initiated by a taxpayer. This is just the IRS of their own accord issues these revenue rulings. There's revenue procedures, and there's notices and announcements, and all these things can be used to argue whether a tax is owed or not. Now, these items cannot be used to argue whether a tax is owed. We have IRS letter rulings such as private letter rulings, determination letters, technical advice memorandum, chief of counsel advice. IRS internal documents such as Internal Revenue Manual, actions on decisions, audit technique guide, and IRS forms and publications. However, does that mean these things are worthless? Well, they're not. I mean, for one thing, they give a lot of good guidance. For another thing, you can rely on these things if you're arguing a penalty is not owed. Secondary sources we're going to talk about in another video. It's going to be exciting. There's going to be good-looking people and action and all that other stuff. Well, not really. It's going to look about like that, but it'll be useful. So, just to recap, and we're going to recap this again later on because it's important. What can you cite to argue a tax is not owed when you are in court? You can cite to the Internal Revenue Code or other applicable federal statutes. You can cite to final and temporary regulations, court decisions, revenue rulings, revenue procedures, and Internal Revenue Code, or IRS, that's supposed to say actually, notices and announcements. However, substantial authority, you could cite to pretty much everything that we mentioned here, probably even citing to your forms and IRS publications. You can use those for authority to avoid an understatement penalty. So if you have any questions, please contact me, and now you can proceed to the next part of the module.